morning, gentlemen. It's a wonderful weather. The monsoon season is on in India, and I thought it's a nice time to talk to you. I'm going to today focus on Africa. Africa was known as the Dark Continent. Now, I don't know what's the meaning of the word Dark Continent and why this name came up, but it was a name which was coined by the Western imperialists because they felt Africa was a country which was devoid of light, which was devoid of knowledge, and was a primitive country, and they called it the Dark Continent. And also because of the fact that it had never been explored. Now, I will mention the name of one man here, that is Dr. David Livingstone. He was a Scottish gentleman who spent a lot of time in Africa exploring lots of places. He enunciated 3 C's, the first of which was Christianity, the second commerce, and the third civilization. He was of the view that it was the duty of the Western powers to occupy or colonize the whole of Africa, spread Christianity, and bring the African tribes into the modern world, or rather to civilize them. So this was the basis of the Western philosophy, and they were not bothered about the indigenous culture of the Africans. It's a fact of history that before the 18th century, Africa had hardly any countries, and most of the nation was divided among clans and tribes who kept on an internecine warfare. And the age of colonialism had commenced in the 19th century, and there was a land grab, and Africa was up for grabs. Now, why? That was because Africa had lots and lots of minerals, and Europe had nothing. The European economy was going down, and they thought it's a good idea to exploit the so-called Dark Continent and get all the minerals, etc., for Europe. In addition, Africa was a very, very lucrative destination for the slave trade. African slaves, including young girls, were captured, put on ships, taken to America, South America, Cuba, all over the world. With the abolition of the slave trade, obviously the West was looking for some other source of income, and that source of income came to the exploitation of the African nations by capturing their raw material and their resources like diamonds, gold, iron ore, everything which Europe didn't have. And there was a time at the beginning of the 19th century when 95% of Africa was colonized by the European powers. Now I will give you an idea that in 1884 there was a convention held in Paris, and this was a convention on Africa, and it had about 17 or 18 countries attending, including the United States and the European powers. And surprisingly, or rather I think pointedly, not a single representative from Africa was included in that conference. It was in that conference decided that Africa would be divided between the various European powers. And this is what happened. The bulk of the share was taken by the British, which occupied, or rather conquered, the eastern part of Africa, right from Egypt down to South Africa along the coast. And the second was the French, which took over French Equatorial Africa and other places. And the French and the British were the main eaters of the spoils of Africa. Of course, there were smaller countries like Italy took over Libya, and then Belgium took over what is known as the Belgian Congo. And what was the life of the people there under the imperialist powers? I don't think the imperialist powers had any intention of improving the lives of the people. All they were interested in was the spread of Christianity, number one. Why? Because they felt, well, Christians will be more amenable to our influence. Two, they wanted exploitation, and the African locals had a very terrible time. And number three, they were keen to take all the raw materials away from Africa to Europe for their factories, because the industrial revolution was on at that time. Gentlemen, this is a fact of history. I think it's no other nation has been, or continent, has been so exploited as Africa. The French had a different method of administration compared to the British, and certain nations in Africa, they assimilated as part of France, like Algeria. They began to think of it as a French overseas territory and integrated with the French Republic. But the Algerians didn't want it, so they started a war. But that was much later. By 1860, the entire Algeria had been occupied by France, and in addition, Libya had been occupied by Italy, and the whole of Central Africa, with all the countries, were all occupied by France, which is known as the French Equatorial African region, and the other regions were taken over by the British. The British rule was a little better, but no way good. They were worse off in their treatment of the locals than they did in India. India, they still treated the Indians a little better, but the Africans were treated very poorly by the British. The British ruled Egypt also, but there was a marked change there. There they didn't enforce Christianity, and some places they even built some mosques in Egypt because they respected the Egyptian civilization, and the Egyptians became more enslaved and began to send many of their children to school in England. But other parts of Africa, like from Zimbabwe downwards, South Africa, it was the supremacy of the white man. The French were bigger racialists, and they carved out small countries of Africa into regions, and they had one controlling head with the Governor General to sit in Dhaka, and then they had lieutenant governors all over the place. And their aim was only one, was to control the African population, and they did it very skillfully through the local leaders whom they were able to entice and lure them into their fold. So Africa was an exploited nation, and at conservative estimation, I think from the 17th century onwards till 1960, when the African states were given independence by France and England, they must have siphoned very close to $200 to $300 trillion. And in the recent conference, which was recently held, I think, in Europe, Mr. Ramaphosa, who's the president of South Africa, had said that you must give us all that money back with 25% interest. So that is the thinking in Africa. They know that they've been exploited. The exploitation continued even after the French left, technically in 1960. France began to maintain its own troops in this region, and the exploitation continued. The African masses didn't benefit for anything. But history is a cycle. Colonialism died after 1945. That was because of the defeat of France and England by Hitler. Now, when I say defeat, I don't mean a military defeat. Ultimately, these people won the battle, the World War II, with the help of the Russians in particular, and economic support from America. But the fact is that both the countries, France and England, were so emaciated that they could not control onto their empires, which they had been doing for the last 100 years. India is a classic example. The British decided to leave and just packed their bags and left. The French wanted to hold on to their possessions, but they forgot the fact that the mother country had been defeated by Hitler in that famous Battle of France. Inside 40 days, the French were defeated. They didn't know what to do. They had a so-called invincible line called the Maginot Line, and this was supposed to be a defensive fortification at Germany, but was breached inside 48 hours, and the French surrendered soon. Well, gentlemen, with the mother country defeated, the colonies were left on their own, and that is the time there was a resurgence. And there's something called the Free French. They started attacking places like Gabon, where the Vichy government had the support, and it was all over for the French, frankly. After 1945, the French tried to reassert in Indochina, but there also they were badly defeated. And then came the civil war, or the war against France as far as Algeria is concerned, and soon the Algerians had completely harassed the French so badly they had to leave. I think it was General de Gaulle who saw the writing on the wall and decided to leave Algeria. And once they left Algeria, they also decided to leave all the other African countries. At the same time, they created a French atmosphere. That is why in all these countries, the main language spoken is French. While in the countries in East Africa, that is from Kenya downwards to South Africa, the language is English. As I've told you, Livingstone's other stunt was to expand the base of Christianity, and they were very successful. The entire Equatorial Africa, East Africa and South Africa became Christian. And even now they are Christian. Nothing wrong with spreading Christianity, certainly. But the way it was done was obnoxious. And the slave trade is a big, big blot on Christianity. If you have gone through the slave trade, which was rampant right up to 1860, the slaves were herded into big dungeons, and before they were put on board of the ships with chains around them, they were given sermons by the Christian priests. You can just imagine a man who's going to be put on hold of a ship to do slavery all his life and probably going to die. He's being given sermons on converting to Christianity. And the Western powers, in particular the French, brought no development in Africa. Now that's a point I must tell you this. Somebody told me, Arey Baba, they made roads, they made railway line. Yes, they did at certain places. And if you go through the way they made them, their main aim was only to be able to collect or connect the mineral-rich areas with the seaports so they could export these to Europe. And for 100 years or more, 200 years, this continued. Earlier the slave trade, they were earning money out of it. And then came this dastardly thing of taking away all the minerals from Africa and giving nothing to the Africans in return. Belgium was the worst of the lot. They brought about no progress in the Belgium Congo, and the king was just having a ball in his kingdom and on all the riches which was coming from Congo, because Congo was a mineral-rich area, and it was all over the same story everywhere. And the French went away, leaving a presidential form of government in a lot of places. Why? Because they felt if we have to manipulate these nations later, then we must have one man only whom we have to deal, and he'll be the president. And they went about doing all that crap, But everything continues for some time, and then the clock has to stop and go forward, and it sometimes rewinds. And now things have changed. The West African nations have realized that the Western powers, particularly the imperialists, the Europeans, have been exploiting them for the last 300 years, and they got nothing in return. And that is why Mr. Ramaphosa, the South African president, had claimed that they should return entire money back, almost 400 trillion, with 25% interest. And now I come to what is happening now. There is a resurgence in Africa, and it is articulated by two countries. The first is Niger, and the second is Gabon. Both these countries have decided, or rather on their own, they have had military coups, and the presidents of both these countries have been arrested and overthrown. And in Niger, there is a tremendous anti-French feeling going on. And France, which has about 1,500 troops in the region, these troops are just confined to their barracks, and the French ambassador has been expelled, and he's just sitting there for the heck of it. France wanted the military intervention, and they had asked whether Libya or Algeria would allow their troops to fly across, because Niger is a landlocked area, but it was refused. And that's the end of the story of the French intervention. They don't have anything. I don't think French have a leg to stand on. As I said, the British were a shade better in the sense they incorporated a lot of local people in the administration. So did the French, but the French treated everybody so badly. And they treated them more as serfs, slaves. If you go through the old pictures of the time, you will find the Englishmen sitting in big carriages and being pulled by the local African men. And then people like Livingstone went and created all hell, by saying the 3 C's, that there should be Christianity, commerce and civilization, and it's the duty of the European powers to civilize the Africans. It was a very stupid thing to say, and that doesn't detract from his activities as an explorer, but shows the bent of mind. Gentlemen, Africa is resurgent now, and the French are having a tough time. Even in Central Africa, in Gabon, you know what's happened? The army has taken over, and though it's a relatively affluent country, they don't want the French there. Same thing in Niger, they don't want the French, and there are demonstrations all around us going that we got everything, we got so much of minerals which are going to France even now, and we get nothing. It's a fact. Now the French have built up certain client states around this region, and these are planning a military intervention there. I don't know whether they're going to succeed or what's going to happen. I hope they fail, but the invasion hasn't begun, but they have been threatening it. And France is standing firm. But I think the French have not realized that the days of the French gunboat diplomacy are over. The sooner the Macron realizes this home truth, France will be better off. As a world power, France is finished. It's nowhere. And it's catching the coat lapels of Uncle Sam and trying to project itself as a great power, which it is not. The French are trying to befriend India by giving lots of technology and weapons, but they should be very, very careful as far as India is concerned. They have got embroiled in the Ukraine war, which is very bad. And this is the one which is going to pinch them. It's going to be the Achilles heel. The French in Africa also have not assessed the situation properly. They should have left gracefully. And I have yet to understand why did the Western powers, the Europeans in particular, treat the African people so badly. That's number one. Number two, what was the reason of not making any development at all? If Livingstone had said that civilization was to be brought in, why didn't they bring it in? Why didn't they develop those areas? They did nothing there. And even in 1960, when these countries got the independence, disease and malnutrition was rampant. Who's responsible for it? None other than the colonizers, that is the French, as far as Central and Equatorial Africa is concerned. So, gentlemen, I think it's about time the French realize that their days are over and they can keep talking about old things. Belgium, for example, you just remember they were very, very terrible as far as their occupation of the Congo was concerned. And they don't have a face to show there now. The Italians also have been thrown out from Libya and Ethiopia. It's all very, very stupid. But I'm afraid the Western powers have not realized this yet, and they're still hanging on because the hangover of colonialism and the desire to control the world has not gone, and that is manifest now in their approach in Africa, in which they're still trying to play one African nation against another. Now, most of the African nations, gentlemen, I tell you, got no history, frankly, because this is the creation of the states. If you look at the map of Western Africa, you will find that there are geometric lines drawn. These were drawn by the French, dividing certain areas into countries, geometrically with a foot ruler. They did the same thing in the Middle East, where the French and the British got together after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and made countries with a foot ruler, on a map. Well, gentlemen, I think I'll close now. I've made my point. There's a resurgence in Africa, and they are definitely going to have their pound of flesh now. It's the era of Africa. They got the minerals, they got the resources, and they need good people to help them develop. China is doing it, and India is the other country which will help the Africans go forward. I close now, my gentlemen, and say, Jai Hind, glory to India. Look out for yourself. Why not subscribe to my channel? I look forward to it. And share to your friends. God bless.